The sharp whistle of wind through the gymnasium doors was the only warning before 17-year-old Emma Rodriguez felt rough hands grab the hem of her modest gray skirt. Time seemed to freeze as Kyle Patterson's fingers found purchase on the fabric, his cruel laughter echoing off the polished basketball court walls. But what Kyle didn't know as he prepared to humiliate the quiet transfer student in front of half the school was that those same hands he was about to violate belonged to someone who could break a concrete block with her bare fist. Someone who had spent 11 years perfecting the ancient art of turning an opponent's aggression against them. Someone who was about to teach Millbrook High's golden boy the most painful lesson of his privileged life. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Emma Rodriguez had learned to make herself invisible long before she ever set foot in Riverside High School. It was a skill she perfected during those final months in Phoenix, watching her mother cry over hospital bills and insurance paperwork while her little sister Izzy pretended not to notice their father's empty chair at the dinner table. Moving to Millbrook, Oregon 3 weeks into the fall semester hadn't been about fresh starts or new opportunities. It had been about survival. About finding a place where Rosa Rodriguez could afford rent on a nurse's salary and where 2 teenage girls could finish their education without the constant reminder of everything they'd lost. The small apartment they now called home sat on the wrong side of Millbrook's carefully maintained social divide, in a complex where the paint peeled around the windows and the heating system coughed like an old man with pneumonia. Emma's bedroom, barely large enough for a twin bed and a small desk, looked out onto the parking lot where her mother's 10-year-old Honda sat between a rusted pickup truck and a motorcycle that never seemed to run. It was a far cry from their suburban Phoenix home, but Emma had learned not to mourn what was gone. Instead, she focused on what remained. What remained was discipline. What remained was the muscle memory of thousands of hours spent in the dojo, perfecting kata forms until they flowed like breathing. What remained was the quiet strength her sensei had taught her, the kind that didn't need to announce itself. To be real, Emma had been 6 years old when her father first brought her to Master Chun's academy, hoping martial arts might help his shy daughter find confidence. 11 years later, she carried a third-degree black belt in Shotokan karate, and the kind of calm presence that could stop a room without saying a word. But at Riverside High, Emma Rodriguez was just another face in a sea of flannel shirts and basketball jerseys, another outsider trying to navigate the complex social ecosystem of a small Oregon town where everyone's parents had graduated from the same high school decades earlier. The building itself felt like a monument to tradition, with trophy cases stretching the length of the main hallway and team photos dating back to the 1950s, covering every available wall space. The message was clear. This was a place where athletic achievement mattered above all else, where the right last name could excuse almost any behavior, and where being different meant being invisible at best. Kyle Patterson had never been invisible a day in his life. At 18 years old and standing 6 feet 4 inches tall, he commanded attention the moment he walked into any room, his Letterman jacket hanging perfectly across shoulders that had been sculpted by years of dedicated basketball training. His dark hair was always styled with the kind of casual precision that suggested expensive products and morning routines most teenagers couldn't afford. When Kyle smiled, which he did often, it was with the easy confidence of someone who had never been told no about anything that truly mattered to him. Being the son of Police Chief Robert Patterson came with certain advantages in a town like Millbrook. Teachers remembered Kyle's father as a star athlete from his own high school days, back when the family name first became synonymous with local success. Coaches knew that any disciplinary issues involving Kyle would likely result in uncomfortable conversations with one of the most powerful men in town. Students understood that crossing Kyle Patterson meant crossing a family that had deep roots and long memories in a community where reputation was everything. Kyle's girlfriend, Jessica Walsh, played her supporting role perfectly, her blonde hair always camera-ready and her smile bright enough to distract from the calculated coldness in her pale blue eyes. She was the kind of girl who could deliver cutting remarks with the sweetness of honey, who understood that in high school social politics, sometimes the cruelest wounds were inflicted with surgical precision rather than blunt force. Together, Kyle and Jessica ruled over Riverside High's social hierarchy like young royalty, dispensing approval and punishment with equal measure. Emma had managed to avoid their attention for almost 3 weeks, keeping her head down and her schedule simple. She arrived each morning just before the first bell, attended her classes without drawing notice, and left as soon as her final period ended to walk the 12 blocks to Millbrook Books, where she worked part-time shelving inventory and helping customers find their next escape into fiction. The owner, Mrs. Patterson, no relation to the police chief, she was always quick to clarify, had taken pity on the quiet girl who'd answered her help wanted advertisement with a handwritten note and impeccable references from her previous job at a Phoenix bookstore. The work was peaceful, surrounded by the comforting smell of paper and ink, the soft conversations of customers discussing their latest literary discoveries, and the rhythmic sound of Mrs. Patterson's ancient cash register marking each sale. Emma found solace in the organization of it all, the way books could be categorized and shelved according to clear systems that made sense. Unlike high school social dynamics, the Dewey Decimal System never changed its rules without warning. Her sister Izzy had been less successful at maintaining a low profile. At 14, Isabella Rodriguez possessed their father's easy laugh and their mother's stubborn streak, a combination that made hiding in plain sight nearly impossible. She'd already joined the school newspaper and volunteered to help with set design for the drama club's fall production. Emma watched her sister navigate the freshman social scene with a mixture of admiration and protective anxiety, knowing that, in a place like Millbrook, standing out could be dangerous for a girl whose family couldn't afford the kind of legal protection that money and connections provided. It was Izzy who first mentioned Maya Chen, the junior who spent her lunch periods in the photography darkroom developing film for the school newspaper and yearbook. Maya was one of those students who existed in the comfortable middle ground of high school society, not popular enough to attract the attention of Kyle's crowd, but talented enough to earn respect from teachers and classmates alike. Her photographs regularly appeared on the front page of the Riverside Reporter, the school's weekly newspaper, and her artistic eye had already caught the attention of college recruiters from several prestigious journalism programs. Emma might have continued her invisible existence indefinitely, if not for the incident in AP biology that changed everything. She'd been working on a lab assignment about cellular respiration, carefully documenting her observations with the kind of meticulous attention to detail that made her a favorite among science teachers. The experiment required precise timing and steady hands, skills that came naturally to someone who had spent years practicing catiforms that demanded absolute precision. Derek Williams, her lab partner, was a quiet boy who reminded Emma of herself. In many ways, he kept his head down, did his work without complaint, and seemed grateful for a partner who wouldn't make him feel stupid for asking questions. Derek had been at Riverside High since kindergarten, but his family's financial struggles and his own naturally introverted personality had kept him firmly in the background of school social life. He was the kind of student teachers liked, but other students barely noticed, which made him the perfect witness to observe how Kyle Patterson really treated people when he thought no one important was watching. During their lab work, Derek had quietly shared stories that painted a disturbing picture of Kyle's behavior over the years. There was the 8th grade incident where Kyle had locked a younger student in a gym locker overnight, claiming it was just a prank when the boy was found crying and dehydrated the next morning. There was the ongoing harassment of Marcus Thompson, a sophomore whose older brother had once dated Jessica before Kyle claimed her as his territory. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. There were the smaller cruelties that added up over time. Lunch money stolen from freshmen, homework assignments destroyed just before they were due, cruel nicknames that stuck long after their targets wished they could disappear entirely. Each story Derek told made Emma's jaw clench a little tighter, her hands forming unconscious fists beneath the lab table. She recognized the pattern, the way bullies always seemed to find victims who couldn't fight back, who lacked the social power or family connections to make their tormentors face real consequences. It was the kind of systematic cruelty that thrived in environments where authority figures looked the other way, where being well-liked mattered more than being decent. Emma had been raised to believe in justice, in the idea that people should be held accountable for their actions, regardless of their last name or social status. Her father had been a mechanic who treated every customer with the same honest respect, whether they drove a luxury sedan or a beat-up truck held together with duct tape and prayer. Her mother had chosen nursing because she believed in healing, in making people's lives better rather than worse. The values they'd instilled in their daughters didn't include tolerance for the kind of behavior Derek was describing. But Emma also understood the reality of her situation. She was the new girl, the outsider whose family couldn't afford to make waves in a small town where everyone knew everyone else's business. Challenging someone like Kyle Patterson would mean painting a target on her back, and potentially on her sisters as well. It would mean risking the fragile stability her mother had worked so hard to build in the months since their father's death. It would mean giving up the careful invisibility that had kept her safe since arriving in Millbrook. The decision might have remained theoretical if Kyle hadn't decided to make Emma his next target. It started small, the way these things always did. A deliberately loud comment about her secondhand clothes when she passed his lunch table. A suggestion that maybe she should consider transferring to the community college if Riverside High's academic standards were too challenging for someone from her background. Jessica's perfectly timed giggles that somehow made every insult sound even more cutting than it already was. Emma endured it all with the same calm patience she'd learned from years of martial arts training. Master Chun had taught her that true strength came from knowing when not to use your power, that the most skilled fighter was often the one who never had to fight at all. She breathed through the anger, focused on her studies, and reminded herself that Kyle Patterson's opinions about her clothes or her background had no real impact on her life or her future. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning in late October, when the autumn rain had turned Millbrook streets into rivers of orange and yellow leaves. Emma had been running late after staying up too late, helping Izzy with an algebra assignment that had brought their younger sister to frustrated tears. She'd grabbed the first clean outfit she could find, which happened to be the gray wool skirt her grandmother had sewn for her 16th birthday, paired with a simple white blouse and the black cardigan that had been her father's last Christmas gift to her. The skirt was beautiful in its simplicity, cut in a classic island style that fell modestly to just below her knees. Her grandmother had spent hours hand-stitching delicate embroidered flowers along the hemline, tiny roses and daisies. That caught the light when Emma moved. It was one of the few pieces of clothing she owned that made her feel truly elegant, like the kind of girl who belonged in the pages of the classic novels she loved to read during her breaks at the bookstore. Kyle Patterson noticed the skirt the moment Emma walked through the main entrance of Riverside High that morning. She saw him nudge Derek Thompson, saw Jessica's eyes narrow as they took in Emma's appearance, saw the cruel smile that spread across Kyle's face like oil on water. Emma quickened her pace, hoping to reach her first period classroom before whatever Kyle was planning could unfold. But the hallways were crowded with students grabbing books from their lockers and socializing before the morning bell. The attack came without warning. Just as Emma was passing the basketball team's trophy case, near the gymnasium entrance. Kyle stepped out from behind a pillar where he'd been waiting, his friends forming a loose semicircle that blocked Emma's escape routes. His hands shot out faster than she'd expected, fingers grabbing the fabric of her skirt with a grip that spoke of someone accustomed to taking whatever he wanted without permission. Time slowed as Emma felt the material begin to strain under Kyle's pull, heard the collective gasp of students who had stopped to watch the confrontation, saw the phones that appeared seemingly from nowhere to document her humiliation. For a split second, she was just another victim, another story Derek Williams would someday tell in hushed tones to a lab partner who might or might not care about the injustice of it all. But then muscle memory kicked in, 11 years of training, taking over before conscious thought could interfere. Emma's left hand shot up to grip Kyle's wrist with the kind of precision that could have dislocated his shoulder if she'd chosen to follow through. Her right hand formed a perfect knife edge that stopped exactly 1 inch from Kyle's exposed throat, close enough that he could feel the controlled power behind it, but not close enough to actually make contact. The hallway fell completely silent, except for the sound of Kyle Patterson's sharp intake of breath as he realized that the quiet girl, whose skirt he'd tried to lift, was holding him in a grip that could have ended his basketball career with a simple twist of her wrist. Emma's dark eyes met his pale blue ones, and for the first time in his privileged life, Kyle Patterson understood what it meant to face someone who wasn't afraid of him. Emma's voice, when she finally spoke, carried the kind of calm authority that made everyone within hearing distance pay attention. "I think you should let go now," she said, her tone suggesting that this was friendly advice rather than a demand, though everyone present understood the implicit threat behind her words. Kyle released her skirt immediately, stumbling backward, as Emma smoothly released his wrist and stepped away from him. The crowd of students who had gathered to witness his latest act of cruelty now found themselves watching something entirely different. Kyle Patterson, star athlete and untouchable golden boy, backing away from a girl who was 8 inches shorter than him and probably weighed 60 pounds less. "What the hell?" Kyle managed to stammer, his voice cracking slightly on the words. His face had gone pale except for 2 bright red spots on his cheeks, and Emma could see his hands shaking as he flexed his fingers to make sure his wrist still worked properly. Emma smoothed down her skirt, checking to make sure her grandmother's careful stitching hadn't been damaged by Kyle's rough handling. When she looked up again, her expression was perfectly calm, as if the last 30 seconds had been nothing more than a minor inconvenience in her morning routine. "I said I think you should let go," she repeated, her voice carrying easily across the silent hallway. "And you did. So thank you for that." The dismissal in her tone was unmistakable, and Kyle's face flushed an even deeper shade of red as he realized that she was treating him like a child who had been corrected and was now expected to move along. His friends shifted uncomfortably behind him, clearly unsure how to respond to a situation where their leader had been so thoroughly outmaneuvered by someone they'd expected to be an easy target. Jessica Walsh was the first to find her voice, her words dripping with the kind of venom that came naturally to someone who had never faced real consequences for her cruelty. "Who do you think you are?" she demanded, stepping forward until she was close enough that Emma could smell her expensive perfume. "Do you have any idea who you just threatened?" Emma turned her attention to Jessica with the same calm patience she'd shown Kyle, taking in the perfectly styled hair, the designer clothes, the manicured nails that had probably never touched anything more challenging than a smartphone screen. When she spoke, her voice held no anger, no defensiveness, just a simple statement of fact that somehow managed to be more devastating than any insult could have been. "I know exactly who he is," Emma said quietly. "The question is, do you?" The silence that followed Emma's question stretched like a taut wire through the crowded hallway. Students pressed closer, sensing that something unprecedented was unfolding before their eyes. Kyle Patterson, golden boy of Riverside High, stood frozen with his mouth slightly open, still flexing his wrist where Emma's grip had left invisible marks that would remind him of this moment for days to come. Jessica's perfectly glossed lips pressed into a thin line as she processed what had just happened. In her carefully constructed world, girls like Emma Rodriguez were supposed to cower and apologize when confronted by their social superiors. They were supposed to understand their place in the hierarchy and accept whatever treatment was deemed appropriate by those who mattered. This quiet confidence, this refusal to be intimidated, was entirely outside Jessica's experience, and therefore deeply threatening to everything she believed about how the world worked. "You have no idea what you just started," Jessica hissed, her voice low enough that only Emma could hear the full venom in her words. "My family has been in this town for 4 generations. Kyle's father runs the police department. You're nobody from nowhere, and you just made the biggest mistake of your pathetic little life." Emma tilted her head slightly, studying Jessica's face with the kind of clinical interest she might show when examining a particularly aggressive wasp that had somehow found its way indoors. There was something almost fascinating about watching someone reveal their true nature so completely, stripping away all pretense of civility to show the ugly reality beneath the polished surface. "That's interesting," Emma said, her tone conversational rather than confrontational. "I was raised to believe that a person's worth had more to do with their character than their family history or their father's job title. But I suppose we all learned different lessons growing up." The crowd of students had grown larger now, forming a rough circle around the confrontation as word spread through the school's social network with the speed that only truly shocking gossip could achieve. Emma could hear whispered conversations, fragments of speculation about who the new girl thought she was, and whether Kyle Patterson had finally met his match. Some voices carried excitement, as if the speakers had been waiting years to see someone stand up to the school's unofficial royal family. Kyle finally found his voice again, though it came out higher and shakier than his usual commanding tone. "You think you're tough because you know some kung fu moves?" he demanded, trying to reclaim some measure of control over the situation. "This isn't some movie, freak. This is real life, and in real life, people like you don't get to embarrass people like me without consequences." Emma's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her posture, a subtle adjustment that anyone trained in martial arts would have recognized as a fighter settling into a more balanced stance. The movement was so slight that most observers missed it entirely, but Kyle caught it and took an involuntary step backward, his body responding to signals his conscious mind didn't fully understand. "You're absolutely right," Emma agreed, her voice still maddeningly calm. "This isn't a movie. In movies, bullies usually learn their lessons through some dramatic confrontation where the hero delivers a stirring speech about justice and everyone learns to be better people. But in real life, bullies typically continue their behavior until someone makes it clear that there will be real consequences for their actions." Derek Williams stood at the edge of the crowd, his heart pounding as he watched the confrontation unfold. He'd witnessed Kyle's cruelty countless times over the years, had seen the basketball star reduce other students to tears with his casual meanness, had watched teachers and administrators look the other way rather than confront someone whose father wielded so much influence in their small community. But he'd never seen anyone face Kyle down with such complete composure, never watched someone treat the school's most feared bully like he was nothing more than a minor annoyance. "Maya!" Chun pushed through the crowd, her camera hanging around her neck as always, though she made no move to document this particular moment. Her photographer's eye took in every detail of the scene. Emma's relaxed but alert posture, Kyle's obvious discomfort despite his attempt to project aggression, Jessica's barely contained fury, and the faces of the gathered students ranging from shock to admiration to barely concealed glee at seeing their tormentors challenged. As the school's unofficial documentarian, Maya had captured hundreds of moments of student life over her 3 years at Riverside High. She'd photographed pep rallies and academic competitions, homecoming courts and science fair winners, but she'd never seen anything quite like this. There was something electric in the air, a sense that the carefully maintained social order was being challenged in a way that couldn't be easily dismissed or covered up. The first bell rang, cutting through the tension like a knife. Students began to disperse reluctantly, clearly disappointed that they wouldn't get to see how this confrontation resolved. Kyle seized on the interruption as an opportunity to salvage some dignity from the situation, straightening his Letterman jacket and shooting Emma a look that promised this wasn't over. "Enjoy your 15 minutes of fame, Rodriguez," he said, his voice carrying just enough volume to ensure that nearby students could hear his parting shot. "But don't get too comfortable. This town has a way of putting people in their proper place." Emma watched him walk away, noting the forced swagger in his stride, the way he kept his shoulders squared despite the obvious tension in his movements. She recognized the type from her years of martial arts training. Kyle was someone who had never learned to lose gracefully because he'd rarely been forced to lose at all. That kind of unchecked ego created dangerous blind spots, areas where pride and assumption could lead to serious miscalculations. As the hallway emptied, Maya Chun approached Emma with the careful steps of someone approaching a potentially dangerous animal. She'd heard the stories about the new girl, the whispered speculation about her background and her family's circumstances, but nothing she'd heard had prepared her for what she'd just witnessed. "That was either really brave or really stupid," Maya said, adjusting her camera strap nervously. "I'm not sure which, but it was definitely something." Emma turned to face her, taking in the girl's earnest expression and the obvious intelligence behind her dark eyes. Maya Chun had the look of someone who spent a lot of time observing rather than participating, someone who understood the value of seeing clearly rather than simply accepting surface appearances. "Probably a little of both," Emma admitted, hefting her backpack and checking her schedule for her first period class. "But sometimes you reach a point where the cost of staying silent becomes higher than the cost of speaking up." Maya nodded slowly, understanding passing between them despite their brief acquaintance. "I'm Maya," she said, extending a hand that Emma shook with the same firm grip she'd used to control Kyle's wrist moments earlier. "I work for the school newspaper and yearbook. I've been watching Kyle Patterson make people miserable for 3 years, and I've never seen anyone shut him down like that." "Emma Rodriguez," she replied, noting the strength in Maya's handshake and the calluses on her fingers that spoke of someone who worked with her hands regularly. "And I didn't shut him down. I just set a boundary. There's a difference, is there?" Maya asked, genuine curiosity in her voice. "Because from where I was standing, it looked like you just redrew the entire map of this school's social structure." Emma considered this as they walked toward the classroom wing, their footsteps echoing in the now empty hallway. She'd spent enough time in new schools to understand how quickly reputations were formed, and how difficult they could be to change once established. In the space of 5 minutes, she'd gone from invisible outsider to someone who had publicly challenged the most untouchable student at Riverside High. The implications of that transformation would ripple through every aspect of her school experience from this day forward. "Maybe," she said finally, "but maps can always be redrawn again if the person holding the pen doesn't like the new geography." Maya's expression grew more serious. "Kyle's not going to let this go," she warned. "His whole identity is built around being the king of this place. You just knocked his crown sideways in front of half the school. He'll find a way to make you pay for that." Emma paused outside her AP history classroom, considering Maya's words. She'd faced this kind of situation before, though never in such a public forum. Bullies were fundamentally predictable creatures, driven by the need to maintain their position in whatever hierarchy they'd managed to climb. When that position was threatened, they almost always escalated rather than backing down, at least initially. "I know," she said simply. The question is whether he's smart enough to recognize when he's outmatched, or if his pride will make him keep pushing until he forces me to demonstrate exactly how outmatched he really is. There was something in Emma's tone that made Maya study her face more carefully. The new girl spoke with the quiet confidence of someone who had faced real adversity and emerged stronger for it. There was no bravado in her words, no teenage posturing or empty threats. Just a calm assessment of the situation and its likely outcomes. "You really think you can handle Kyle and his whole crew?" Maya asked, lowering her voice as other students began filtering into the classroom behind them. Emma's smile was small but genuine. "Maya, I've been handling bullies since I was old enough to walk to school by myself. The only thing that changes is the size of their fists and the sophistication of their threats. But underneath all the posturing, they're all the same. They pick on people they think can't fight back, and they fold when someone finally does." The warning bell rang, signaling that first period would begin in 2 minutes. Maya hesitated, clearly wanting to continue the conversation, but aware that they both needed to get to class. "Look," she said finally, "if you need someone who knows how this place really works, someone who's been documenting Kyle's behavior for years, I might be able to help. I've got photographs, records, testimonies from students who were too scared to speak up officially. If you're planning some kind of campaign against him, you don't have to do it alone." Emma felt something warm unfurl in her chest at the offer. She'd grown so accustomed to facing challenges in isolation that the idea of having an ally, especially one with Maya's resources and knowledge, was both appealing and slightly overwhelming. In Phoenix, she'd had her dojo family, a network of fellow martial artists who understood the principles of mutual support and collective strength. Since her father's death and their subsequent move to Millbrook, she'd felt adrift, cut off from the community that had helped shape her into the person she'd become. "I appreciate that," Emma said, meaning it more than her casual tone suggested. "But I'm not planning a campaign. I'm just trying to get through my senior year without having to seriously hurt someone who probably doesn't deserve permanent damage for being an entitled jackass." Maya's eyebrows rose at this unexpected revelation. "Permanent damage?" Emma's expression grew more serious. "Maya, I've been studying martial arts since I was 6 years old. I hold rank in a style that was originally developed for battlefield combat. If Kyle pushes this beyond verbal threats and minor physical contact, if he escalates to the point where I genuinely fear for my safety or my sister's safety, then we're going to have a very different kind of conversation than the one we had in the hallway this morning." The second bell rang, and Maya hurried into her first period journalism class while Emma slipped into a P history, taking her usual seat in the back corner where she could observe without being observed. Mrs. Martinez, the history teacher, was already beginning her lecture on the causes of World War I, but Emma found it difficult to focus on the complex web of alliances and tensions that had led to global conflict when she was dealing with a much more immediate and personal version of the same dynamics. Throughout the morning, Emma could feel the weight of curious stares and whispered conversations following her through the hallways. The story of her confrontation with Kyle had spread with the kind of speed that only truly scandalous gossip could achieve in a small high school. Each retelling seemed to add new details, some accurate and others wildly embellished, until by lunch period she was hearing third-hand accounts that had her performing elaborate kung fu demonstrations and threatening to break Kyle's arm in front of the entire student body. In a P biology, Derek Williams approached her with the kind of nervous excitement usually reserved for meeting celebrities. "Emma," he whispered as they set up their lab equipment, "is it true that you actually grabbed Kyle Patterson's wrist and made him back down?" Emma measured out precisely 3 milliliters of solution before answering. "I prevented him from damaging my clothes," she said matter-of-factly. "Everything else is probably exaggeration." Derek's eyes widened. "But you actually touched him?" "And he didn't," Like, immediately have you expelled or arrested or something? The question revealed so much about the climate of fear that Kyle had created at Riverside High that Emma felt a fresh surge of anger at the injustice of it all. In Derek's world, simply defending yourself against Kyle Patterson was seen as an act of such daring that it bordered on the suicidal. That anyone should have to live with that level of intimidation was deeply offensive to everything Emma had been taught about justice and personal dignity. "Derek," she said gently, "Kyle Patterson is just another teenage boy with impulse control issues and an inflated sense of his own importance. He's not a superhero, and he's definitely not invincible. The only power he has is what other people give him through their fear." "But his father," Derek began, "is the police chief of a small town in Oregon," Emma finished. "Not the emperor of the known universe. There are limits to what even Chief Patterson can do for his son, especially if that son keeps making poor decisions in front of witnesses." Derek absorbed this information with the intensity of someone receiving classified intelligence. "So, you're saying Kyle can actually be stopped?" Emma completed her measurements and began mixing the solutions with practiced precision. "I'm saying that everyone can be stopped, Derek. Some people just require different methods than others." The rest of biology class passed without incident, but Emma could feel Derek's excitement radiating from the lab station next to hers. For someone who had spent years watching Kyle's reign of terror from the sidelines, the idea that the basketball star might finally face real consequences was clearly intoxicating. Emma hoped Derek's enthusiasm wouldn't make him do something foolish that would paint an even larger target on his back. Lunch period brought its own challenges. Emma typically spent the time in the library, using the quiet atmosphere to catch up on homework or simply read for pleasure. But as she approached the library entrance, she noticed Kyle and several of his friends stationed near the circulation desk, their presence making it clear that her usual refuge had been temporarily compromised. Instead, she headed for the courtyard, a small outdoor space behind the cafeteria where students could eat lunch when the weather permitted. October in Oregon was notoriously unpredictable, but today had brought one of those rare moments of crystalline sunshine that made the Pacific Northwest's reputation for constant rain seem like a malicious rumor. Maya Chun was already there, sitting alone at a picnic table with her camera and a brown bag lunch spread out before her. She looked up as Emma approached, gesturing to the empty space across from her with a sandwich that appeared to have been assembled with more attention to nutritional balance than aesthetic appeal. "Figured you might need a place to sit," Maya said, her tone carefully casual. "Kyle's been making the rounds all morning, making sure everyone knows that you're on his bad side now. The library's definitely off limits for you today." Emma sat, her own lunch on the table, a simple affair of leftover soup in a thermos and a piece of her mother's homemade bread wrapped in wax paper. "And you're not worried about guilt by association?" she asked, genuinely curious about Maya's motivation for offering friendship to someone who had just painted a target on her back. Maya bit into her sandwich and chewed thoughtfully before answering. "Emma, I've been watching Kyle Patterson torment people for 3 years. I've taken pictures of kids crying in bathroom stalls after he humiliated them. I've interviewed students who were too afraid to put their names on record when reporting his behavior. I've watched teachers and administrators pretend not to see things that should have gotten him suspended or expelled a dozen times over." She paused, taking a sip from her water bottle before continuing. "So no, I'm not worried about guilt by association. If anything, I'm hoping that maybe this time will be different. Maybe this time someone will finally stand up to him and make it stick." Emma studied Maya's face, noting the determination in her dark eyes and the slight set to her jaw that suggested a strength that ran deeper than her quiet demeanor might indicate. "You've been building a case against him," she realized. "All those interviews, all those photographs. You're not just documenting his behavior for posterity. You're gathering evidence." Maya's smile was rueful. Fat lot of good it's done me so far. Every time I try to get something published in the school paper, the administration shuts it down. Every time I present evidence to the principal's office, it mysteriously disappears or gets dismissed as hearsay. Kyle's father has too much influence, and Kyle himself is too valuable to the basketball program for anyone to want to rock the boat. So what's your endgame? Emma asked, genuinely curious about Maya's long-term strategy. If the school won't act on your evidence, and the local authorities are compromised by family connections, what were you planning to do with all that documentation? Maya's expression grew more serious. I was hoping to build a strong enough case that I could take it outside the local system. State education officials, maybe the district attorney from the county seat, someone with the authority and independence to actually do something about it. But I needed something big, something so undeniable that it couldn't be swept under the rug or explained away as typical teenage drama. Emma felt the pieces of a larger puzzle beginning to click into place. Maya wasn't just a student journalist with a grudge against the school's golden boy. She was someone who had been methodically building a case for years, waiting for the right moment or the right catalyst to bring Kyle's reign of terror to an end. Emma's confrontation with Kyle that morning hadn't just been a dramatic moment of personal defiance. It had been the opening move in what could become a much larger campaign for justice. And now you think that moment might have arrived? Emma asked, her voice carefully neutral despite the growing excitement she felt at the possibility of having a true ally in her fight against Kyle's bullying. Maya nodded slowly. Emma, what you did this morning was more than just standing up to a bully. You showed every student in this school that Kyle Patterson isn't invincible, that he can be challenged and forced to back down. That's going to change things one way or another. The question is whether we can guide that change in a direction that actually helps people. Emma considered this as she ate her soup, tasting the familiar flavors of her mother's cooking and thinking about the conversation she'd had with Rosa Rodriguez the night before. Her mother had been exhausted after a double shift at the hospital, but she'd still taken the time to ask about Emma's day, to listen to her concerns about fitting in at a new school, to offer the kind of quiet support that had always been Rosa's greatest strength. My mother didn't raise me to go looking for fights, Emma said finally. But she also didn't raise me to let bullies hurt innocent people when I have the power to stop them. If Kyle escalates the situation, if he starts targeting other students because of what happened between us this morning, then I'll have to consider more direct action. Maya leaned forward, her eyes brightening with interest. Define direct action. Emma's smile was small but meaningful. Let's just say that Kyle Patterson has no idea what he's actually dealing with. He sees a quiet girl from a poor family who got lucky with one unexpected move. He has no concept of what 11 years of serious martial arts training actually means, or what someone with that background is capable of when properly motivated. And if he pushes you to the point where you feel properly motivated? Emma finished her soup and carefully screwed the cap back onto her thermos. Then Kyle Patterson is going to learn some very expensive lessons about the difference between being popular and being powerful, and about what happens when you mistake someone's kindness for weakness. The warning bell for fifth period rang across the courtyard, signaling the end of lunch. Maya packed up her camera and lunch supplies with practiced efficiency, while Emma gathered her own belongings. As they walked back toward the main building, Maya's expression grew more thoughtful. Emma, she said as they approached the hallway where they would split off toward their respective classrooms, would you be interested in seeing some of the evidence I've collected about Kyle over the years? Not for any specific reason, just to give you a better understanding of exactly who you're dealing with. Emma paused at the intersection of two hallways, considering the offer and its implications. Looking at Maya's evidence would mean crossing a line from personal self-defense to active involvement in a larger campaign against Kyle. It would mean accepting that her Confrontation with him that morning was just the beginning of something much more complex and potentially dangerous. But it would also mean that she wouldn't be facing Kyle's inevitable retaliation alone. It would mean having access to information that could help her predict his moves and prepare appropriate responses. Most importantly, it would mean that other students who had suffered under Kyle's cruelty might finally see some measure of justice for what they'd endured. "Yes," she said simply. "I think I'd like to see what you've got." Maya's smile was fierce and satisfied. "Meet me in the dark room after school. And Emma, bring your sister if you want. Something tells me Izzy Rodriguez is going to want to be part of whatever comes next." The dark room at Riverside High existed in a state of controlled chaos that somehow made perfect sense to Maya Chun. Red-tinted bulbs cast everything in an otherworldly glow, while shallow trays of developer solution sent sharp chemical scents drifting through the air. Photographs hung from lines stretched across the ceiling like strange fruit, images of school life captured in various stages of development. Emma found herself studying the pictures as she waited for Maya to finish securing the door behind them, noting the way Maya's camera seemed to capture moments that revealed more truth than their subjects probably intended. Izzy Rodriguez perched on a stool near the enlarger, her dark eyes wide with fascination as she took in the mysterious processes of analog photography. At 14, Emma's younger sister possessed an insatiable curiosity about how things worked, whether those things were mechanical devices, social systems, or the complex motivations that drove people to make the choices they did. The darkroom represented a perfect intersection of art, science, and mystery that appealed to every aspect of Izzy's personality. "This is incredible," Izzy breathed, reaching out to touch one of the photographs hanging overhead, before catching herself and pulling her hand back. "You develop all of these yourself?" Maya smiled at the younger girl's enthusiasm, remembering her own first exposure to the magic of watching images emerge from blank paper in chemical baths. "Every single one," she confirmed, moving to a filing cabinet tucked into the corner of the room. "Digital photography is faster and more convenient, but there's something about working with film that forces you to be more intentional about every shot. You can't just delete the mistakes and try again." Emma understood the philosophy behind Maya's approach to photography, recognizing parallels to her own martial arts training. Master Chun had always emphasized the importance of precision and mindfulness, teaching his students that true mastery came not from the ability to execute techniques quickly but from the discipline to execute them correctly every single time. There were no shortcuts to excellence, no digital editing tools that could fix fundamental flaws in form or technique. "So what exactly have you been documenting about Kyle Patterson?" Emma asked, settling into a chair that had clearly been salvaged from some long-forgotten classroom renovation. The furniture in the darkroom had the mismatched quality of pieces that had been acquired through necessity rather than design, but everything was scrupulously clean and organized according to Maya's particular system. Maya opened the filing cabinet and withdrew a thick folder that had been labeled simply KP in her neat handwriting. The folder was stuffed with photographs, newspaper clippings, handwritten notes, and what appeared to be printed emails or text message conversations. She set it on the work table with the reverent care usually reserved for handling ancient manuscripts or explosive devices. 3 years of research, Maya said, her voice carrying a mixture of pride and frustration. "I started collecting this stuff sophomore year after I watched Kyle reduce Marcus Thompson to tears during lunch period. He took Marcus's lunch money and then made him get down on his hands and knees to pick up the coins Kyle threw on the floor. Everyone just watched it happen like it was normal entertainment." Izzy's expression darkened as she listened to Maya's account. Despite being new to Riverside High, she'd already heard whispered stories about Kyle's behavior from other freshmen who had learned to avoid certain hallways and bathrooms where the basketball star was known to hold court. The idea that such cruelty could be treated as acceptable entertainment made her stomach turn with a familiar mixture of anger and helplessness. Emma opened the folder and began examining its contents with the methodical attention she brought to all serious tasks. The first section contained dozens of photographs that Maya had taken surreptitiously over the years, images that captured Kyle in moments of casual cruelty or entitled behavior. There were pictures of him cornering younger students in empty hallways, shots of his victims' faces after encounters that had left them humiliated or frightened, and documentation of property damage that had been attributed to accidents or pranks, despite the obvious malicious intent behind the destruction. "This is comprehensive," Emma observed, noting the timestamps and detailed captions Maya had added to each photograph. "You've been building a criminal case, not just collecting evidence of bad behavior." Maya nodded grimly. "The more I documented, the clearer the pattern became. Kyle doesn't just bully people randomly. He targets specific types of victims: new students who don't have established social networks, kids from families with financial problems, anyone who stands out as different or vulnerable. It's systematic predation disguised as teenage social dynamics." Izzy leaned over Emma's shoulder to examine a particularly disturbing photograph that showed a freshman boy sitting alone in a bathroom stall, his shirt torn and his face streaked with tears. "Who is that?" she asked quietly. "Tommy Chun," Maya replied, her voice heavy with remembered anger. "Maya's my cousin." Kyle decided Tommy was too weird for Riverside High because he's on the autism spectrum and has trouble with social cues. Kyle spent 2 weeks making Tommy's life hell before Tommy's parents finally pulled him out and enrolled him in private school. Emma felt her jaw clench as she studied the photograph. Tommy Chun couldn't have been more than 13 years old when the picture was taken, and the expression of bewildered pain on his young face was almost unbearable to witness. The fact that Kyle had targeted a vulnerable child and driven him from the school entirely spoke to a level of cruelty that went far beyond typical teenage social aggression. What did the administration do when Tommy's parents complained? Emma asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Maya's laugh was bitter and humorless. Principal Morrison called it a misunderstanding between boys and suggested that Tommy might be happier at a school that was better equipped to handle his special needs. Kyle got a stern talking to about being more inclusive, and the whole thing was swept under the rug within a week. Emma continued examining the evidence Maya had collected, her anger growing with each new revelation about Kyle's behavior and the system that protected him. There were screenshots of social media posts where Kyle had shared humiliating photos of other students without their consent. There were witness statements from victims who had been too frightened to report their experiences officially, but had trusted Maya enough to share their stories privately. There were records of property damage, academic sabotage, and even evidence of Kyle using his father's position to intimidate families who had considered filing formal complaints. One particular document caught Emma's attention: a printed email exchange between Kyle and several other basketball players that had somehow made its way into Maya's possession. The conversation detailed plans to humiliate a girl named Sarah Martinez during the previous year's homecoming dance, including explicit discussions about spiking her drink and filming the results for later entertainment. "Maya," Emma said carefully, holding up the printed emails, "how did you get access to these?" Maya's expression became guarded. "Let's just say that not everyone on the basketball team is completely loyal to Kyle Patterson. There are a few players who've grown tired of his behavior, but are too afraid of losing their positions to speak up publicly. One of them occasionally shares information with me when Kyle crosses lines that make them uncomfortable." Izzy read over Emma's shoulder, her face growing pale as she absorbed the content of the email exchange. "Did this actually happen? Did they hurt Sarah Martinez?" "Sarah transferred schools 2 weeks after homecoming," Maya replied quietly. Her family cited personal reasons for the move. But I heard from friends that she'd been hospitalized that night with what the doctors called alcohol poisoning. She never spoke publicly about what happened, but she did give me a written statement before she left town. Emma felt a cold fury building in her chest as she processed the implications of what Maya was showing her. This wasn't just bullying, or even criminal harassment. Kyle Patterson was operating what amounted to a systematic campaign of terror against vulnerable students, using his privileged position and family connections to escape consequences for behavior that would have landed anyone else in jail. How many victims are we talking about? Emma asked, her voice carefully controlled despite the rage she felt building inside her. Maya gestured to the thick folder and 2 additional files stacked beneath it. Documented cases? At least 15. Students over the past 3 years. But those are just the ones who were willing to talk to me, at least unofficially. I suspect the real number is much higher. Emma stood up abruptly, needing to move as she processed the scope of Kyle's crimes and the magnitude of the injustice that had been allowed to continue unchecked. She began pacing the small confines of the dark room, her movements precise and controlled despite the emotional turmoil she felt. Izzy watched her sister with growing concern, recognizing the signs that Emma was transitioning from calm observer to active combatant. "Emma," Izzy said softly, "what are you thinking?" Emma paused in her pacing, turning to face both Maya and her sister with an expression that would have been familiar to anyone who had spent time in Master Chun's dojo. It was the look Emma wore when she had finished analyzing a problem and arrived at a solution that would require all of her skill and determination to execute properly. "I'm thinking that Kyle Patterson has been operating under the assumption that his victims would never fight back in any meaningful way," Emma said, her voice carrying the quiet intensity that those who knew her had learned to respect. "He's built his entire system of control around the idea that people will be too afraid, too isolated, or too powerless to challenge him effectively." Maya felt a shiver of anticipation run down her spine. "And you're planning to prove him wrong?" Emma's smile was sharp and dangerous. "Maya, you've spent 3 years documenting Kyle's crimes and building a case that any competent prosecutor would love to get their hands on. But you've been trying to work within a system that's been corrupted by the very person you're trying to stop. Kyle's father controls local law enforcement. The school administration is either intimidated by the Patterson family or actively complicit in covering up Kyle's behavior. Traditional channels aren't going to work because they've been compromised from the beginning. So what do you suggest?" Maya asked, leaning forward with intense interest. Emma moved to the work table and began organizing Maya's evidence into neat stacks, her mind working through the tactical possibilities with the same systematic approach she brought to analyzing complex martial arts techniques. "We need to create a situation where Kyle's behavior becomes so public and so undeniable that even his father can't make it disappear. We need to force him to reveal his true nature in front of witnesses who can't be intimidated or bought off." Izzy's eyes brightened with understanding. "You're going to make him attack you in public." "Not attack," Emma corrected gently. "I'm going to create conditions where Kyle feels compelled to escalate his harassment to the point where he commits crimes that can't be explained away as teenage pranks or misunderstandings. And when he does, we're going to make sure that everything is documented thoroughly enough to build an airtight case." Maya began to see the shape of Emma's strategy, and her photographer's instincts immediately started working through the technical challenges involved. "You're talking about orchestrating a confrontation where Kyle incriminates himself on camera." "Among other things," Emma agreed. "But it has to be handled carefully. We can't manufacture evidence or entrap him into doing something he wouldn't normally do. We can only create opportunities for Kyle to reveal who he really is when he thinks he's safe from consequences." Emma picked up one of Maya's photographs, an image that showed Kyle shoving a smaller student into a locker while his friends laughed in the background. The casual cruelty captured in the picture was damning. But Emma understood why it hadn't been enough to bring real consequences. A single photograph could be explained away, dismissed as taken out of context or misinterpreted by people who didn't understand the full situation. The key is pattern recognition, Emma continued, setting the photograph back on the table. One incident can be explained as an isolated mistake or a moment of poor judgment. But when you document a clear pattern of predatory behavior over an extended period, when you show systematic targeting of vulnerable victims, when you demonstrate that someone is using their position of privilege to harm others repeatedly, that becomes much harder to dismiss. Maya nodded slowly, her journalistic training helping her understand the standards of evidence that would be required to make their case stick. So we need multiple incidents, multiple witnesses, multiple forms of documentation. We need to show that Kyle's behavior isn't random teenage aggression, but calculated predation. Exactly, Emma confirmed. And we need to make sure that when Kyle inevitably escalates his harassment of me, he does it in ways that clearly demonstrate criminal intent. No more ambiguous situations that can be explained away as mutual combat or self-defense. We need Kyle to reveal himself as the predator he really is. Izzy had been listening to this exchange with growing excitement, but now a note of concern crept into her voice. Emma, this sounds really dangerous. What if Kyle doesn't just escalate to harassment? What if he tries to seriously hurt you? Emma's expression softened as she looked at her younger sister, understanding the fear behind Izzy's question. The two sisters had always been close, but their father's death had created an even stronger bond between them. Izzy had watched Emma struggle with grief and financial stress over the past year, had seen her older sister sacrifice her own needs to help support their family, and the idea of Emma deliberately putting herself in danger was almost unbearable. Izzy, Emma said gently, moving to sit beside her sister, I understand why you're worried, but you have to remember what I've been training for my entire life. Master Chun didn't just teach me how to throw punches or execute takedowns. He taught me how to control confrontations, how to de-escalate violence when possible, and end it quickly when necessary. She took Izzy's hands in hers, noting how much her sister had grown over the past year, how the frightened 14-year-old who had clung to her after their father's funeral was developing into a strong, thoughtful young woman with her own sense of justice and determination. More importantly, Emma continued, this isn't just about me anymore. Kyle Patterson has been hurting people for years, and he's going to keep hurting people until someone stops him. Maya's shown us that at least 15 students have been victims of his harassment and assault. How many more will there be if we don't act? Maya had been watching this exchange with growing respect for both Rodriguez sisters. Emma's protective instincts toward Izzy were obvious, but so was her commitment to protecting other vulnerable students from Kyle's predation. And Izzy, despite her youth and obvious concern for her sister's safety, was clearly intelligent enough to understand the larger implications of their situation. There's something else you should know, Maya said quietly, drawing both sisters' attention back to her. Kyle's been asking questions about you, Emma. He's been trying to find out where you live, where you work, what your family situation is. He's also been spreading rumors about you around school, trying to undermine your credibility before you have a chance to build any real support network. Emma felt a familiar chill run down her spine, the same instinctive alertness that she'd learned to trust during her years of martial arts training. Predators always gathered intelligence about their intended victims before striking, looking for vulnerabilities they could exploit and escape routes they could use if their attacks went wrong. What kind of rumors? She asked, her voice carefully neutral. Maya consulted her notes, flipping through several pages of handwritten observations she'd made over the past few days. He's telling people that you're mentally unstable, that you attacked him unprovoked in the hallway, that your family moved here because you were expelled from your previous school for violent behavior. He's also spreading stories about your father's death, claiming that he was involved in criminal activity and that's why your family had to leave Arizona." Izzy's face flushed with anger at these lies about their father, but Emma placed a calming hand on her sister's arm before she could explode into the furious defense that Kyle's slander deserved. Emma had expected this kind of character assassination, understanding that Kyle would try to isolate her socially before escalating to more direct forms of attack. "Classic predator behavior," Emma observed calmly. "He's trying to make sure that when he does escalate his harassment, I won't have any witnesses who are willing to testify on my behalf. If he can convince people that I'm dangerous and unstable, then any violence he commits against me can be framed as necessary self-defense." Maya's respect for Emma's tactical understanding continued to grow. "So how do we counter that strategy?" Emma stood up and began pacing again, her mind working through the complex chess game that her conflict with Kyle was becoming. She needed to stay several moves ahead of him, anticipating his strategies and preparing appropriate responses while avoiding the kind of obvious traps that could backfire and play into his narrative about her being unstable or dangerous. "We document everything," she said finally. "Every interaction, every rumor, every attempt at intimidation or social manipulation. We build a timeline that shows Kyle's escalating harassment and my consistent attempts to avoid confrontation. When he finally pushes things to the point where I have to defend myself physically, we want a clear record showing that I tried every other option first." She turned to face Maya directly. "And we need to identify potential allies among the student body and faculty. People who have been victims of Kyle's behavior in the past. People who have witnessed his cruelty but been too afraid to speak up. People who are disgusted by the way the administration has enabled his behavior. We need to build a coalition that can't be dismissed or intimidated." Maya nodded enthusiastically. "I can help with that. I know several students who would be willing to speak up if they thought there was actually a chance of Kyle facing real consequences. And there are a few teachers who have been frustrated by the administration's refusal to address his behavior." "Good," Emma said. "But we have to be careful about how we approach them. Kyle's going to be watching for signs that we're organizing opposition to him, and he'll try to intimidate or discredit anyone who shows support for our cause. We need to build our network quietly and make sure that people understand the risks they're taking by getting involved." Izzy had been listening to this strategic discussion with growing fascination, recognizing that her sister was operating on a level of tactical sophistication that went far beyond simple martial arts training. "Emma, where did you learn to think like this? This isn't just about fighting. This is like military strategy or something." Emma's smile was tinged with sadness as she thought about the lessons that had prepared her for this kind of conflict. "Izzy, when Dad died, I had to learn how to protect our family in ways that went beyond physical self-defense. I had to learn how to navigate insurance companies that were trying to deny our claims, how to deal with bill collectors who were threatening to take our house, how to research schools and neighborhoods when we had to move. I learned that fighting isn't just about who can hit harder. It's about who can think more clearly under pressure and who can build better alliances with people who share their interests." The explanation seemed to satisfy Izzy's curiosity, but Emma could see that her sister was also beginning to understand the broader implications of their situation. This wasn't just about stopping Kyle Patterson from harassing them personally. It was about challenging the system of privilege and corruption that had allowed someone like Kyle to operate with impunity for years. Maya began gathering up her evidence, files, organizing them back into the systematic arrangement she used to keep track of her growing case against Kyle. "So what's our next move?" she asked. Emma considered the question carefully, weighing the various tactical options available to them. Kyle's rumor campaign suggested that he was preparing for a more direct confrontation, probably within the next few days. She needed to be ready for that escalation while also advancing her own strategy of building support and documenting his behavior. "Tomorrow, I'm going to make myself visible," Emma decided. I'm going to eat lunch in the cafeteria instead of hiding in the library or courtyard. I'm going to participate in class discussions. I'm going to act like a normal student who isn't afraid of Kyle Patterson or intimidated by his threats. And when he escalates? Maya asked. Emma's smile was calm and confident. When he escalates, we're going to be ready to document everything. And Kyle Patterson is going to learn the difference between picking on isolated victims and challenging someone who knows how to fight back. The cafeteria at Riverside High buzzed with its usual chaotic energy as Emma Rodriguez walked through the entrance with her brown bag lunch, her posture relaxed but alert. The large room was divided into invisible territories, as rigid as any medieval kingdom, with each social group claiming their traditional tables and defending them against invasion by outsiders. Emma had avoided this particular battlefield for weeks, preferring the quiet sanctuary of the library or the fresh air of the courtyard. But today she walked directly to an empty table in the center of the room where her presence would be impossible to ignore. Maya Shun was already positioned at a nearby table with her camera bag discreetly placed beside her chair, ready to document whatever unfolded. She'd spent the morning spreading word through her network of contacts that something significant might happen during lunch period, ensuring that key witnesses would be present when Kyle inevitably made his move. Derek Williams sat at the far end of Maya's table, ostensibly working on homework but actually keeping watch for any signs of trouble. Even Izzy had convinced her friends to claim a table with a clear view of where Emma was sitting, her freshman, eyes bright with nervous excitement and protective fear for her older sister. The reaction to Emma's presence was immediate and electric. Conversations faltered as students noticed the quiet girl who had publicly humiliated Kyle Patterson now sitting in plain sight, like she belonged there. Some faces showed admiration for her courage, others displayed the morbid fascination of spectators waiting for a gladiatorial combat to begin. But most showed the kind of nervous uncertainty that came from witnessing someone break unspoken rules about how their social hierarchy was supposed to function. Kyle Patterson entered the cafeteria 15 minutes later, his usual entourage trailing behind him like courtiers following a temperamental king. His eyes immediately found Emma at her central table, and something dark and hungry flashed across his features. For 3 days, he'd been spreading poison about her throughout the school, painting her as unstable and dangerous, building a narrative that would justify whatever he planned to do next. But Emma's calm presence in the heart of his domain was a direct challenge to his authority that he couldn't allow to stand. Jessica Walsh whispered something in Kyle's ear that made his jaw clench with barely controlled rage. Emma couldn't hear the words, but she could see the effect they had on Kyle's expression, the way his hands curled into fists at his sides. She recognized the signs of someone whose anger was about to overcome their ability to think strategically. And she felt the familiar calm that always settled over her when a confrontation became inevitable. Kyle's approach was theatrical in its arrogance, his footsteps heavy enough to draw attention from every corner of the cafeteria. He stopped directly in front of Emma's table, his 6'4" frame casting a shadow across her simple lunch of soup and homemade bread. His friends arranged themselves in a semicircle behind him, their phones already recording what they expected to be Emma's public humiliation and submission. Well, Kyle said, his voice carrying easily across the now silent cafeteria. Look who decided to crawl out of her hole and join the real students for lunch. I hope you're not planning to stay long, Rodriguez. This table's reserved for people who actually belong at this school. Emma looked up from her soup with the same calm interest she might show when studying an interesting but ultimately harmless insect. She took a slow spoonful of her mother's homemade soup, chewed thoughtfully, and swallowed before responding in a voice that carried clearly despite its quiet tone. That's interesting, Kyle, she said, gesturing to the empty chairs around her table. I don't see any reserved signs. But if you'd like to sit down and discuss school policies about cafeteria seating, I'm happy to listen to your concerns. The offer was delivered with such perfect sincerity that several students actually laughed, recognizing the subtle mockery hidden beneath Emma's polite words. Kyle's face flushed red at the sound of laughter directed at him rather than his intended victim, and Emma could see his self-control beginning to fracture under the pressure of public scrutiny. "You think you're funny?" Kyle snarled, leaning forward to place his hands on Emma's table in a move clearly designed to intimidate through physical dominance. "You think because you got lucky with one cheap shot in the hallway, you can just walk around here like you own the place?" Emma set down her spoon and looked up at Kyle with an expression of genuine puzzlement. "I'm not sure what you mean by cheap shot, Kyle. As I recall, you grabbed my clothing without permission, and I simply asked you to let go, which you did very politely. I thought we'd resolve that misunderstanding quite amicably." Though reminded of his humiliation in front of the entire school sent Kyle's anger boiling over the edge of rational thought. He straightened up and stepped around the table, moving to stand directly beside Emma's chair in a position that would give him maximum physical advantage if he decided to escalate to violence. Emma could smell the expensive cologne he wore to mask the scent of nervous sweat, could see the pulse pounding in his neck as his heart rate spiked with adrenaline. "Listen carefully, you little freak," Kyle hissed, his voice low enough that only Emma and the students at immediately surrounding tables could hear the full venom in his words. "I know all about your family. I know your daddy was a drunk who wrapped his car around a tree because he couldn't handle his problems like a man. I know your mother works double shifts wiping bedpans at the hospital because she can't afford to keep her family together any other way. And I know you and your little sister are living in that welfare housing complex on Elm Street like the white trash charity cases you really are." Emma felt something cold and deadly settle in her chest as Kyle's words registered. He had indeed done his research, learning intimate details about her family's circumstances and her father's death that could only have come from someone with access to police reports and hospital records. The casual cruelty with which he wielded this private information, the obvious pleasure he took in her family's pain, revealed a depth of malice that went far beyond typical teenage bullying. But Emma had been prepared for this moment. She understood that Kyle would eventually try to break her composure by attacking the things she held most sacred, and she had spent years learning to control her emotional responses even under extreme provocation. When she spoke, her voice remained perfectly level, though something in her dark eyes made Kyle take an involuntary step backward. "You're right about several things, Kyle," Emma said, her words carrying clearly through the hushed cafeteria. "My father did die in a car accident. My mother does work extremely hard to support our family. And we are living in subsidized housing while we rebuild our lives after a tremendous loss." She stood up slowly, her movements fluid and controlled, rising to her full height of 5 feet 6 inches. Even though Kyle towered over her, something in her bearing made him seem smaller, diminished by the calm dignity she radiated in the face of his crude attacks. "But you're wrong about the most important thing," Emma continued, her voice gaining strength and clarity with each word. "You seem to think that my family's financial situation or my father's death somehow makes me weak or vulnerable to your threats. You think that because we've faced hardship, I'll be easier to intimidate than your usual victims." Kyle opened his mouth to deliver another cruel taunt, but Emma's next words cut through his bluster like a sword through silk. "What you don't understand, Kyle, is that my father taught me that strength isn't measured by the size of your bank account or the influence of your family name. He taught me that real power comes from standing up for people who can't protect themselves, from facing adversity with dignity, and from never allowing bullies to harm innocent people when you have the ability to stop them." The cafeteria had gone completely silent now, every student straining to hear Emma's words. Even the lunch staff had stopped their usual clattering of trays and serving utensils to listen to the confrontation unfolding in their midst. Maya's camera was positioned perfectly to capture every moment, while Derek had his phone recording from a different angle to ensure they had multiple perspectives of whatever happened next. "So here's what you're going to do, Kyle," Emma said, her voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that made everyone present understand they were witnessing something extraordinary. "You're going to apologize for your disrespectful comments about my father and my family. You're going to sit down at your own table and finish your lunch quietly. And you're going to stop harassing me, my sister, and every other student in this school who doesn't have the family connections to fight back against your cruelty." Kyle's face had gone pale, except for 2 bright spots of color on his cheeks. The public nature of Emma's challenge, delivered in front of half the school's student body, made backing down impossible without losing face completely. But something in Emma's posture, in the way she held herself with perfect balance and controlled readiness, suggested that escalating to physical violence might be an even worse mistake. "And if I don't?" Kyle managed to ask, his voice cracking slightly on the words. Emma's smile was small and infinitely dangerous. "Then you'll discover exactly what 11 years of serious martial arts training looks like when applied by someone who's tired of watching bullies hurt innocent people." Kyle's friends began shifting uncomfortably behind him, suddenly aware that their leader had maneuvered himself into a situation where all of his options carried significant risks. If he backed down now, his reputation as the school's untouchable alpha would be destroyed. But if he escalated to violence against someone who had just claimed extensive martial arts training, he might find himself on the wrong end of a beating that would be even more humiliating than backing down. The decision was made for him when Jessica Walsh, perhaps sensing that Kyle was paralyzed by indecision, stepped forward and shoved Emma hard in the shoulder with both hands. "Nobody talks to my boyfriend like that, you pathetic little..." Jessica's words were cut off as Emma moved with liquid grace, stepping aside to let Jessica's aggressive momentum carry her past while simultaneously grasping the other girl's wrist and using her own forward motion to send her stumbling into the empty chair Emma had just vacated. Jessica went down in a tangle of limbs and designer clothes, her perfect hair falling across her face as she struggled to understand what had just happened. The technique Emma had used was called Taio Toshi in formal martial arts terminology, a redirection throw that used an opponent's own energy against them, rather than requiring significant force from the defender. To anyone watching who didn't understand martial arts principles, it looked like Jessica had simply tripped over her own feet after missing a clumsy attack. But Kyle, standing close enough to see the precise footwork and timing Emma had employed, understood that he was facing someone with genuine fighting skills. Jessica scrambled to her feet, her face flushed with embarrassment and rage. "You psycho bitch!" she screamed, lunging forward with her fingernails extended like claws, clearly intending to rake Emma's face. This time Emma didn't bother with subtle redirection techniques. She caught Jessica's wrists in a grip that stopped the attack cold, holding the taller girl's hands away from her face with embarrassing ease. Jessica struggled wildly, trying to break free from Emma's hold, but found herself completely immobilized by fingers that felt like steel bands around her wrists. "Jessica," Emma said calmly, her voice carrying clearly through the cafeteria despite Jessica's continued struggling. "I'm going to let go of your wrist now, and you're going to sit down and calm yourself. If you attack me again, I'll be forced to defend myself more assertively, and I don't think you'll enjoy that experience." She released Jessica's wrists and stepped back, giving the other girl room to retreat gracefully. But Jessica, her pride wounded beyond rational thought, immediately launched herself forward again with another wild swing aimed at Emma's head. Emma's response was swift and decisive. She ducked under Jessica's haymaker punch, stepped forward into close range, and executed a perfect osotogari, a major outer reap that swept Jessica's legs out from under her while simultaneously controlling her upper body to ensure she landed safely on her back rather than taking a dangerous fall. The entire technique took less than 2 seconds and left Jessica flat on the cafeteria floor, staring up at the ceiling with a stunned expression while Emma stood over her with barely a hair out of place. The cafeteria erupted in chaos as students jumped to their feet, some cheering Emma's display of skill while others shouted warnings and encouragement to various participants in the confrontation. But beneath the noise, everyone present understood that they had just witnessed something unprecedented in Riverside High's social hierarchy. Jessica Walsh, queen bee of the popular crowd, had been effortlessly defeated by the quiet new girl who supposedly came from the wrong side of town. Kyle stared down at his girlfriend sprawled on the floor, then back at Emma who stood calmly, waiting for his next move. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to attack, to use his size and strength advantage to crush this upstart who had dared to humiliate him and his girlfriend in front of the entire school. But the clinical precision with which Emma had handled Jessica's attack suggested that engaging her physically might result in his own very public defeat. Instead, Kyle chose the coward's path, pulling out his phone and stepping back while shouting loud enough for everyone in the cafeteria to hear. "That's assault. Everyone saw it. I'm calling my father right now, and Emma Rodriguez is going to jail for attacking students." Emma looked around the cafeteria, taking in the faces of dozens of witnesses who had clearly seen Jessica initiate both physical attacks while Emma had done nothing but defend herself with minimal necessary force. Maya's camera had captured everything, while Derek and several other students had recorded the confrontation from multiple angles. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. "By all means, call your father," Emma said, her voice carrying easily through the now quiet cafeteria. "I'm sure Chief Patterson will be very interested to see the video evidence of your girlfriend committing assault while I attempted to de-escalate the situation peacefully. I'm also sure he'll want to discuss the witness statements from the 40+ students who watched the entire confrontation." Kyle's face went ashen as he realized the trap he had walked into. In his anger and desperation to reassert dominance, he had allowed the confrontation to unfold in the most public possible setting, surrounded by witnesses and cameras that would make it impossible to spin the narrative in his favor. Emma had maneuvered him into a position where calling his father would only result in more scrutiny of his own behavior. But Kyle's humiliation was far from complete. Principal Morrison burst through the cafeteria doors, having been summoned by reports of a fight in progress. His eyes immediately found the scene at Emma's table. Jessica sitting on the floor holding her wrists and glaring daggers at Emma. Kyle standing with his phone in his hand looking lost and confused, and Emma standing calmly beside her chair as if nothing unusual had happened. "What exactly is going on here?" Principal Morrison demanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to controlling chaotic situations involving teenagers. Maya Shun stepped forward before Kyle could begin spinning his version of events. "Principal Morrison, I'm Maya Chun from the school newspaper. I was documenting lunch period activities when Jessica Walsh physically attacked Emma Rodriguez twice. Emma defended herself using minimal force while attempting to de-escalate the situation. The entire confrontation was recorded by multiple students and is available for your review." Principal Morrison's expression grew more serious as he processed Maya's words and the implications they carried. A documented assault involving the police chief's son and his girlfriend was exactly the kind of situation that could explode into a public relations nightmare if not handled carefully. "Ms. Rodriguez," he said, turning to Emma with a carefully neutral expression, "are you injured? Do you require medical attention?" Emma shook her head calmly. "No, sir, I'm fine." Jessica never made contact with any of her attacks. "I was able to defend myself without anyone getting seriously hurt." "And you, Ms. Walsh?" Principal Morrison asked, noting Jessica's disheveled appearance and the way she was still rubbing her wrists. Jessica started to launch into a furious tirade about Emma's psychotic behavior, but Principal Morrison cut her off with a raised hand. "Save it for my office, Ms. Walsh. All 4 of you," he said, including Kyle in his stern gaze, "will report to the principal's office immediately for individual interviews about this incident." As the crowd of students began to disperse, buzzing with excitement about what they had witnessed, Emma gathered her lunch and backpack with the same calm efficiency she brought to everything else. She noticed Izzy watching her from across the cafeteria, her younger sister's face showing a mixture of pride, concern, and amazement at what her quiet older sister had just accomplished. The walk to the principal's office felt like a victory parade, with students lining the hallways to watch Emma pass. Some offered quiet words of support, thanking her for standing up to Kyle and Jessica's bullying. Others simply stared in fascination at the girl who had somehow managed to flip Riverside High's social hierarchy upside down in the space of a single lunch period. The interviews that followed were methodical and thorough, with Principal Morrison clearly understanding the serious nature of the situation he was dealing with. Maya's video evidence was reviewed multiple times, showing clearly that Jessica had initiated both physical attacks while Emma had used only defensive techniques designed to protect herself without causing unnecessary harm. Witness statements from dozens of students corroborated this version of events, making it impossible for Kyle or Jessica to claim that Emma had been the aggressor. When Chief Patterson arrived at the school an hour later, his face was grim with the understanding that his son had created a situation that couldn't be swept under the rug through family influence or political connections. The video evidence was too clear, the witness testimony too consistent, and the public nature of the confrontation too widespread to deny or minimize. The consequences were swift and decisive. Jessica Walsh was suspended for 3 days for assault and disorderly conduct. Kyle Patterson, despite not throwing a punch himself, was found to have instigated the confrontation through his harassment and verbal abuse, earning him a 2-day suspension and removal from the basketball team for the remainder of the season. Emma Rodriguez was cleared of all wrongdoing, with Principal Morrison's report noting that she had shown remarkable restraint and maturity in a situation where many students would have escalated to unnecessary violence. But the real victory came in the days and weeks that followed, as Maya's documentation of Kyle's years of bullying finally found its way to the right authorities. The county district attorney, operating independently of Chief Patterson's influence, launched a formal investigation into Kyle's pattern of harassment and assault. Other victims, emboldened by Emma's example and the promise of real consequences, came forward with their own stories and evidence. Within a month, Kyle Patterson faced criminal charges for harassment, assault, and distribution of intimate images without consent. His college scholarship offers were rescinded. His father faced calls for resignation, and the culture of fear and intimidation that had dominated Riverside High for years began to crumble as students realized they no longer had to suffer in silence. Emma Rodriguez continued her quiet existence, focusing on her studies and her part-time job at the bookstore. But she was no longer invisible, no longer the girl who could be dismissed or ignored. She had become something more powerful than any bully could comprehend. She had become proof that courage and skill could triumph over privilege and cruelty, that justice was possible even when it seemed impossible, and that sometimes the quietest people really did have the loudest ways of fighting back. The final image that would live in the memories of everyone who witnessed that day in the cafeteria was not of Emma standing victorious over her defeated opponents, but of her calmly eating her soup after the confrontation ended, as if defending herself against bullies was just another ordinary part of her school day. Because for Emma Rodriguez, master of martial arts and protector of the innocent, it really was just that ordinary. And that quiet confidence, more than any dramatic gesture or boastful threat, was what made her truly dangerous to those who chose to prey on the vulnerable. In the end, Kyle Patterson learned what countless bullies throughout history had discovered too late. that there's nothing more terrifying than a victim who refuses to remain a victim, and nothing more powerful than someone who chooses to use their strength in service of justice rather than personal gain. Emma Rodriguez had taught him that lesson with grace, precision, and just enough force to ensure he would never forget it. 3 months after the cafeteria incident that changed everything at Riverside High, Emma Rodriguez stood in the center of the school gymnasium. Surrounded by members of the newly formed anti-bullying coalition she had reluctantly agreed to help establish. The late afternoon sunlight streamed through the high windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor where Kyle Patterson had once reigned supreme as captain of the basketball team. Now the space served a different purpose entirely. Transformed into a training ground where students learned not just self-defense techniques, but the deeper principles of standing up for themselves and others with dignity and purpose. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, and it certainly hadn't been easy. In the weeks following Kyle's suspension and subsequent arrest, Riverside High had descended into a period of social chaos, as long-established hierarchies crumbled and students struggled to navigate a world where the old rules no longer applied. Some of Kyle's former victims had emerged from the shadows, emboldened by Emma's example to speak their truth and reclaim their power. Others had retreated even further into themselves, overwhelmed by the sudden attention and unsure how to process years of accumulated trauma. Emma had watched this upheaval with the same careful observation she brought to everything else, understanding that real change was never as simple as removing one bad actor from a complex system. Kyle Patterson had been a symptom of larger problems at Riverside High, not their root cause. The culture that had enabled his behavior for years, the administrative indifference that had allowed him to operate with impunity, the social dynamics that had made his victims feel powerless to resist. All of these deeper issues required more sustained effort to address. That's why Emma had agreed to work with Maya, Derek, and several other students to create something more lasting than a single moment of justice. The anti-bullying coalition wasn't just about preventing future Kyle Pattersons from terrorizing their classmates. It was about fundamentally changing how Riverside High approached issues of power, privilege, and personal responsibility. It was about creating systems that would protect vulnerable students before they became victims, rather than simply punishing aggressors after the damage had been done. The first few meetings had been awkward affairs, with students who barely knew each other trying to find common ground beyond their shared experiences of being marginalized or mistreated. Emma had found herself reluctantly cast in the role of leader, simply because she was the one person present who had successfully stood up to Kyle and lived to tell about it. But leadership had never been her goal, and she worked constantly to distribute authority among the group rather than accepting the kind of cult of personality that had made Kyle so dangerous in the first place. Maya Chun had proven invaluable in these efforts, using her journalistic skills to document their discussions and her photographer's eye to capture the gradual transformation taking place within their group. She had also taken on the crucial task of liaison with school administrators, working to ensure that the coalition's recommendations would actually be implemented rather than simply acknowledged and ignored. Her years of building evidence against Kyle had taught her how to navigate bureaucratic resistance and find pressure points that could force institutional change. Derek Williams had surprised everyone, including himself, by becoming one of the coalition's most effective organizers. Years of invisibility had given him an encyclopedic knowledge of Riverside High's social dynamics, and his natural empathy made him skilled at reaching out to students who might otherwise remain isolated. He had a particular gift for identifying the subtle signs of harassment or abuse that adults often missed, and several potential victims had been connected with support resources thanks to his quiet intervention. But perhaps the most unexpected coalition member was Tommy Chun, Maya's cousin who had been driven from Riverside High by Kyle's harassment 2 years earlier. When word of Kyle's arrest reached his family, Tommy had asked his parents if he could returned to finish his senior year at the school that had failed to protect him. His presence served as a living reminder of the real costs of institutional indifference, and his quiet courage in facing the place where he had been tormented inspired other students to find their own voices. The self-defense classes Emma conducted twice a week had grown from an initial group of 5 nervous freshmen to a regular attendance of over 30 students representing every grade level and social group at Riverside High. But Emma was careful to emphasize that physical techniques were only one component of a much larger philosophy of self-protection and community responsibility. She spent as much time discussing conflict de-escalation, situational awareness, and bystander intervention as she did teaching actual martial arts moves. The goal isn't to turn you into fighters, Emma would remind her students at the beginning of each session. The goal is to help you understand your own strength and develop the confidence to use it appropriately. Most conflicts can be resolved without violence if you know how to recognize the warning signs and respond effectively before situations escalate. These lessons had proven their value multiple times already. Sarah Martinez, one of Emma's most dedicated students, had successfully diffused a potentially dangerous situation with an aggressive ex-boyfriend by using verbal de-escalation techniques combined with strategic positioning that gave her clear escape routes. Marcus Thompson had intervened when he witnessed a senior harassing a freshman, using his new understanding of power dynamics to shame the aggressor into backing down without anyone throwing a punch. But it was Izzy Rodriguez who had provided the most dramatic example of how Emma's teachings could be applied in real-world situations. Emma's younger sister had inherited the family's natural athletic ability along with their father's strong sense of justice, and she had thrown herself into learning both the physical and philosophical aspects of martial arts with the same intensity she brought to everything else. The incident had occurred on a Friday afternoon in early December, when Izzy was walking home from school through the park that served as a shortcut between Riverside High and their apartment complex. She had noticed a group of older boys surrounding a younger girl near the playground equipment, their body language and aggressive posturing making it clear that this was not a friendly social interaction. The girl at the center of their attention was clearly frightened, clutching her backpack to her chest while trying to back away from her tormentors. Izzy had recognized the dynamics immediately from her sister's teachings about predator behavior and group intimidation tactics. The boys were using their numerical advantage and larger size to corner their victim, cutting off her escape routes while escalating their verbal harassment to gauge how far they could push before she broke down completely. It was textbook bullying behavior, and Izzy understood that intervention was necessary before the situation became even more dangerous. But rather than charging in with righteous fury, Izzy had remembered Emma's lessons about strategic thinking and tactical planning. She had pulled out her phone and started recording while simultaneously calling out in a loud, clear voice that carried across the entire park. "Hey, isn't that Tommy's little sister? Tommy's going to be so upset when he sees this video of you guys harassing her." The mention of an older brother, combined with the threat of video evidence being shared, had immediate effect on the group dynamic. The boys had quickly realized that their anonymous victim now had a witness willing to document their behavior and connect it to potential consequences. Within moments, they had dispersed, leaving the younger girl shaken but unharmed. When Izzy had shared the story with Emma later that evening, her older sister had felt a surge of pride that went beyond simple family loyalty. Izzy had internalized the most important lesson of martial arts training, that the most effective techniques were often the ones that prevented violence rather than simply winning fights. She had used her intelligence, her understanding of group psychology, and her technological resources to protect someone who couldn't protect herself, all while avoiding the kind of physical confrontation that could have resulted in serious injury for everyone involved. Stories like these had begun to spread throughout Millbrook's small community, creating a ripple effect that extended far beyond the walls of Riverside High. Parents who had previously dismissed their children's complaints about bullying were now taking these concerns seriously, recognizing that the Rodriguez sisters represented something more than just isolated success stories. Local business owners were beginning to sponsor the coalition's activities, understanding that schools free from harassment and intimidation were better for everyone's children. Even the police department had been forced to acknowledge the change in dynamics in their community. Chief Patterson, facing mounting pressure from voters who were disgusted by his son's behavior and his own attempts to cover it up, had announced his intention to retire at the end of his current term. His replacement would be chosen through a competitive process that prioritized community policing and youth outreach over the old boy networks that had protected officers' families from scrutiny for generations. The legal proceedings against Kyle Patterson had moved forward with methodical precision, thanks largely to Maya's meticulous documentation and the courage of victims who had finally found their voices. The young man who had once seemed untouchable now faced multiple felony charges, including sexual harassment, assault, and cyberbullying. His basketball career was over, his college prospects had evaporated, and his family's reputation in Millbrook had been permanently tarnished by his actions and their attempts to cover them up. But Emma took no satisfaction in Kyle's downfall, understanding that his destruction served no one's interests except perhaps those who craved revenge over justice. When she thought about Kyle at all, which was rarely, it was with the same clinical detachment she might feel when observing any other cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked privilege and moral corruption. He had made his choices, and now he was facing the consequences of those choices. That was justice, but it wasn't victory in any meaningful sense. True victory, Emma had come to understand, was measured not by the defeat of individual enemies, but by the creation of systems that prevented future enemies from causing harm in the first place. It was found in the confidence of students who no longer walked Riverside High's hallways in fear, in the willingness of bystanders to intervene when they witnessed injustice, and in the growing understanding that everyone had both the right to be treated with dignity and the responsibility to ensure that others received the same respect. The coalition's most ambitious project had been the implementation of a peer mediation program that trained students to help resolve conflicts before they escalated to violence or administrative punishment. Emma had worked closely with the school counselors to develop protocols that emphasized restorative justice over punitive measures, helping students understand the underlying causes of their conflicts while building skills for more effective communication and problem solving. The program had already mediated dozens of disputes that might otherwise have festered into long-term harassment or exploded into physical confrontations. Students who had been caught spreading rumors learned to understand the real harm their gossip caused and made genuine amends to those they had hurt. Former friends who had fallen out over misunderstandings were helped to rebuild their relationships on stronger foundations. Even some cases of minor bullying were resolved through facilitated conversations that helped aggressors understand the impact of their behavior while giving victims a voice in determining appropriate consequences. Not every case could be resolved through mediation, of course. Some students were too damaged by their experiences to trust peer-led processes, while others were simply unwilling to accept responsibility for their harmful behavior. But the existence of alternatives to the traditional disciplinary system had begun to change the overall culture at Riverside High, creating space for redemption and growth that hadn't existed when Kyle Patterson's approach to conflict resolution had dominated student interactions. Emma's own role in these developments had evolved considerably since that first confrontation in the hallway. She was no longer the invisible new girl trying to avoid attention, but she had also resisted becoming the kind of larger-than-life figure that some students seemed to want her to be. Instead, she had worked to become what Master Chun would have called a quiet leader, someone who influenced others through example and encouragement rather than commands or charisma. Her relationship with her family had also deepened through these experiences. Rosa Rodriguez had initially been terrified when she learned about Emma's confrontation with Kyle, fearing that her daughter's actions would bring retaliation against their vulnerable family. But as she watched Emma handle the aftermath with the same grace and intelligence she brought to everything else, Rosa's fear had transformed into profound pride and admiration. "Your father would be so proud of who you've become," Rosa had told Emma one evening as they sat together in their small kitchen, sharing tea and conversation after another long day. "He always said that true strength wasn't about how hard you could hit, but about how many people you could protect and how much good you could do in the world." Izzy's relationship with her older sister had also evolved through their shared involvement in the coalition's work. Where once she had seen Emma as someone to be protected and worried about, she now understood her sister as a partner in the important work of making their school and community safer for everyone. The two sisters had developed an easy collaboration that combined Emma's tactical thinking with Izzy's natural enthusiasm and social connections. But perhaps the most significant relationship that had developed during this period was Emma's friendship with Maya Shen. What had begun as a strategic alliance between two students who shared a common enemy had grown into genuine mutual respect and affection. Maya's intellectual curiosity complemented Emma's practical wisdom, while Emma's calm confidence balanced Maya's sometimes impulsive passion for justice. They spent hours together working on coalition projects, but they also found time for the kinds of ordinary teenage experiences that Emma had rarely allowed herself to enjoy. Maya introduced Emma to the local photography community, where Emma's natural eye for composition and her understanding of human nature made her surprisingly effective behind a camera. Emma, in turn, had begun teaching Maya basic self-defense techniques, appreciating her friend's quick learning and natural athleticism. The two young women had even begun making plans for college, with Maya encouraging Emma to apply for journalism scholarships while Emma helped Maya research schools with strong martial arts programs. They talked about someday working together on projects that could bring the kinds of changes they had helped create at Riverside High to other schools and communities where students were struggling with similar problems. As spring arrived in Millbrook and Emma's senior year began winding toward its conclusion, she found herself reflecting on how much had changed since that October morning when Kyle Patterson had grabbed her skirt in front of half the school. The girl who had moved to Oregon as a grieving refugee from family tragedy had discovered not just her own strength, but her ability to help others find theirs as well. The anti-bullying coalition would continue its work even after Emma graduated, with younger students like Izzy and Derek taking on leadership roles while Maya documented their progress and maintained connections with sympathetic adults. The peer mediation program had been adopted as official school policy, and other districts were sending representatives to study Riverside High's transformation as a model for their own reform efforts. Emma had received acceptance letters from several colleges, along with scholarship offers that would make higher education financially possible for someone from her background. She had decided to major in social work with a focus on youth advocacy, understanding that the skills she had developed through martial arts training and community organizing could be applied to help vulnerable populations far beyond the boundaries of any single school. But even as she prepared for the next chapter of her life, Emma remained committed to the principles that had guided her through the challenges of her senior year. She would continue to be someone who stood up for those who couldn't protect themselves, who used her strength in service of justice rather than personal gain, and who understood that real power came not from dominating others, but from empowering them to find their own voices. On the last day of classes, Emma stood once again in the gymnasium where so many important moments of her high school experience had unfolded. The Anti-Bullying Coalition was hosting a celebration dinner for graduating seniors, and students from every grade level had gathered to acknowledge the contributions of those who were moving on to college and career. Maya stepped forward to present Emma with a framed photograph that captured her teaching a self-defense class to a group of freshman girls. In the image, Emma's face showed the same calm concentration she had displayed during that first confrontation with Kyle, but now it was focused on nurturing and protecting rather than defending and confronting. "This is how I want people to remember you," Maya said as she handed Emma the photograph. "Not as the girl who took down Kyle Patterson, but as the person who taught all of us that we had more strength than we realized and more responsibility to each other than we had ever understood." Emma accepted the gift with genuine emotion, recognizing the truth in Maya's words. Her legacy at Riverside High wouldn't be defined by a single moment of conflict, but by the countless quieter moments when she had chosen to build rather than destroy, to heal rather than harm, to teach rather than simply demonstrate her own abilities. As the celebration continued around her, Emma felt the same sense of calm satisfaction that always came when she completed a difficult kata or successfully mediated a complex conflict. She had done what needed to be done, had protected those who needed protection, and had helped create something better than what had existed before her arrival. The quiet girl from Phoenix who had moved to Millbrook carrying nothing but grief and determination had discovered that sometimes the most powerful way to fight back wasn't through conflict at all, but through the patient work of building systems that made conflict unnecessary in the first place. She had learned that true martial arts mastery wasn't about defeating enemies, but about creating a world where enemies were no longer needed. And as Emma Rodriguez prepared to leave Riverside High behind and embrace whatever challenges awaited her in college and beyond, she carried with her the knowledge that strength and gentleness were not opposites but partners, that justice and compassion could work together to create lasting change, and that sometimes the quietest voices really could speak the loudest truths of all. The legacy she left behind would continue to ripple through the lives of students she had taught, protected, and inspired, creating waves of positive change that would extend far beyond her ability to see or measure. And perhaps that was the most powerful martial arts technique of all, the ability to create change that outlasted the person who had initiated it, building strength in others that would continue to grow long after the original teacher had moved on to face new challenges and protect new communities. In the end, Emma Rodriguez had proven that being a black belt champion wasn't about the color of the fabric around your waist or the trophies on your shelf. It was about the courage to stand up when standing up was needed, the wisdom to know when fighting was necessary and when it wasn't, and the commitment to use whatever strength you possessed in service of something larger than yourself. And in a small town in Oregon, in a high school where students no longer walked the hallways in fear, that lesson would continue to echo through the lives of everyone who had been touched by the quiet girl who refused to stay quiet when her voice was needed most. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.